Hi, I'm the True Wise Gamer, giving off my vast knowledge so you may understand games a bit better. So let's talk about level 5 again. Last time we talked about level 5 is when I talked about the Ni no Kuni game for the DS, a game that was translated a while back but was never covered by a lot of people, which I'm still happily proud of to this day, as covering it was very interesting and kinda well worth it. Though sadly again, the game has been forgotten and only exists in the osmosis of, oh yeah, this is the original, but here's the real better version, you know what I mean? And like that game, I decided to cover this game as well, that being White Knight Chronicles. It was a game that was going to be made a launch title for the PS3, but due to the director, Akihiro Hino, decided to feel that the game wasn't ready yet and decided to push the game back a bit. In an interview he said, "With White Knight's story, we don't want to release a halfway product," said Hino. "We wanted to have a big title that surpassed the volume of RPGs we've made in the past." I find that line very ironic as we continue on because of something in this game. And with all that said, let us find out if White Knight Chronicles needs to be chronicled as a game to play, or a game best left forgotten to time, in this review of White Knight Chronicles. The game begins with a group of soldiers at the edge of a city of Balindor, which is preparing for the celebration of Princess Cisne's birthday, who hasn't spoken in 10 years after the death of her mother by the Farsian, who are arriving as well to ensure a peace treaty to be brokered and ensure peaceful times. We then follow Leonard, who works at a winery that is now being charged to supply the party, and after grabbing his friend Yuli, they decide to sneak into the ball for some fun. Sadly, they would not be able to enjoy themselves for long, as after a carnival comes into town, it is revealed to be a ploy to get inside the city and wreak havoc on everyone. And as the havoc begins spreading, the Black Knight kills the king and prepares to do the same with the princess, till Leonard intervenes and tries to flee with the princess. That leads them into the Incorrupted, which I will be referring to as the Knight for ease of understanding. While down there, they also meet an old man named Eldor, and explains that it's an ancient weapon made by a people long ago, as the big monster begins following them down there. Leonard decides, fuck it, and puts it on after meeting this guy. Don't worry, he doesn't matter at all. And get used to that, sadly, as I'm going to have to say that a lot, but we'll get into that in due time. In any case, he becomes one with the armor and is able to defeat the monster. However, the princess gets kidnapped, which also becomes a running trend, which I actually don't comment more on, but short version, really not worth it. We are then soon tasked with Yuli and Eldor to try to rescue her and learn what is going on and the conspiracy behind it. Simple premise that I must say, and sadly say, it does not deliver on. I say this with no hyperbole that I think this story is so goddamn boring. Like, on the surface, it seems like a basic story that a lot of people actually, in a lot of the reviews I watched, critiqued and said it was a basic story. But I would even argue that that's not even true, as it's less basic than that. Basic would imply, at least at a certain level, that it's not doing anything worth noting, but it does the job well enough that you're not really worrying about it too much. When I even argue on a fundamental level, it has a hard time even doing that. More times than not, it does not seem to be able to explore what is around it, like the culture and history of a place. To give an example, later on we go to a city called Greed, and it's on top of a huge... I actually have no idea what this thing is, I'm sorry for saying this. Anyway, how did that happen? Why does it even allow them to be on it? How did they learn to control it? Can they control it? No idea. There just seems to be a lack of explanation for everything in the plot, where nothing gets explained unless it's plot related. However, even then, it usually gets elaborated on later on by a point at which you're basically like, why did you bother telling me now instead of earlier when that would have been useful? Because by the point I actually learn it, they don't really matter anymore, and I stopped caring even before that. Like, to give an example, those ancient societies that I mentioned earlier, who made the knights, they aren't named until 3/4 into the game. And even then, not particularly well, because I actually got these two societies confused, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. For the record, it's Yeshinawa are the ones who made the armor and are powered by souls, which how doesn't really matter. It just doesn't matter. And honestly, I couldn't care less. And that is the general problem with the game. Anytime something comes up and needs to be explained, it's just, I don't care, you could have told me earlier. And like, I get it, you don't want to flood a new player with a bunch of explanation that might just sound boring and not relevant to the here and now, but at the same time, not explaining anything can hurt a world more than you would think. To give another example, early on in the game, there was something called the Cataclysm that happened 17 years ago. Even though nobody treats it as though it was this big thing, they don't really explain it and only give us sort of half explanation early on, where it's basically kind of forgotten and rarely referenced, and then near the end when it's actually plot relevant, they actually give a full explanation. And it's like, I can understand the plot point thing, like, okay, sure, but not elaborating on the earthquake beforehand, which is what it was, and they could have just said the earthquake or something like that. My point being is, why did you bother? I think a good way to explain the problem is like it's two jokes between two friends that you weren't there for whatever they're referencing happened, and it's annoying as hell. And when you are explained what happened, you're like, okay, why did you just explain it now instead of earlier? And I don't think it's helped when the characters barely talk to each other, like, at all. There is live chat, which, to side note, you might have been wondering, hey, why is this called the international version? Well, due to some of the delays while trying to translate it over here, they were also working on an update for the Japan version. They decided to just basically put the patch in the disc and just port it out for everyone else, since, might as well not do that before, the day of updates, where basically everything was like this big, huge file, but another time. It actually included a lot of other smaller things like Georama, which I'll talk about in due time, and live chat, where essentially characters would talk outside of combat, and while neat, I could barely hear them. More times than not, it's mostly drowned out by music or combat, and I'll explain the later in a moment because, ugh. But also, just a side note again, because this is something I wanted to mention, who directed this? Like, good lord, the voice acting at times can be all over the place. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's okay. Like, more times than not, it's okay, not great, but it could have been better. Because, like, at a lot of points throughout the entire game, the voice acting is not in line with the mouths, so it gets off at times and it's weird. Like, they sound fine, but again, since they don't match, it's off. And it's not helped when two of the main characters sound terrible. Like, straight up, who chose Eldor's voice to be so low you can barely hear him? Like, sweet Jesus animate Christ, you can barely hear him. In fact, here's a clip of him talking.
He doesn't strike you as a curious fellow.
Why?
Didn't you see? The gems in that fake goddess were real firestones. Not just one, but two of them, mind you. He's no ordinary fool. Otherwise, how would he have gotten those stones? He put far more effort into crafting that fake than we put into finding the real one.
And Kara sounds like someone who could barely talk English. I'm not sure why, it sounds weird. Not like she's bad all the time, it just sounds off. But in any case, live chat seems to be there to try to fill in dead space, but even then, it doesn't really do much of anything as it fails to do the basics right. And I feel like the characters are proof enough of that. As you might have noticed, usually I would talk about the plot a little more until I would start talking about the gameplay. But for here, I'm barely talking about the plot. That's mostly because there's barely a plot here. And that's not helped with the characters. Because you see, the characters are barely archetyped. Leonard's basically the good boy who's in love with the princess. Yuli is the old friend who's into the good guy. but doesn't get the hint. Eldor, the mysterious old man who knows more than he's letting on. Kara, the no-nonsense girl with a bit of other stuff there, but we'll talk about that later. And Caesar is the one who's the most interesting in this plot because he's like the generic snarky boy who has a heart of gold, always has a kind word to say and all that jazz. And I say that he's the most interesting because as the story keeps going, the story begins to focus more on him and actually starts doing stuff in the plot, so I became more invested in him, you know what I mean? And I think it was helped because also around that same time, the gameplay was getting less out of hand, and it was just more or less go to these parts that are really short, so there was less filler in the meantime, which, you know what, let's actually talk about the gameplay now, since at this point, it's better off just to get it all out of the way, since it also ties into another problem we will need to talk about. Gameplay is overall simple. See, the gameplay in a sense tries to mimic MMOs in how they work by selecting a move, then waiting to perform them before you can actually do so. But this was actually very much intentional as it was designed around the idea of this game being a beginner console MMO. In fact, a lot of the reviews I saw for this game actually compared to Final Fantasy XI. I'm not particularly sure, I'm not saying they're wrong, but I would argue it's a more simplified version because of what I played and what my friends have said about it, but otherwise, I argue it's a far worse version than that because, let's just be clear about this is unbearably slow. I swear on my life, this game would be around 10 hours shorter if this game wasn't so godforsaken slow. Like, this game feels laborious and tedious. Like, seriously. This game is too dead simple to require this amount of a time sink. It does not help that the dungeons are also this long, winding snorefest that aren't interesting at all. In fact, a good chunk of them can be just chopped up and just removed, and literally nothing would be lost. And it's really not helped that some enemies spawn in weird places, and that usually means fighting them and dealing with the timer. Usually the timer is there so that online servers can figure out what happened, when, and calculate damage. However, in a game like this, that sort of stuff doesn't matter, like, at all, since at this point in time, it's just a single player game, and I don't have to wait on anyone else in this game. Well, except for an AI team, but even then the game can calculate that on its own easily. Besides that, you can't actually control them, so why have them? I mean, like, you technically can control them and tell them, like, a generic, like, go out them, all four, you know, all that jazz. But even then, just leaving them on their own is more than enough because, well, all the foes are really easy. Like, most foes are easy fodder that can barely be considered a threat. And sure, maybe if they gang up on one unit, maybe. But even then, not really. And you want to know why? That is because everyone in this game can heal. It's kind of like if in Final Fantasy XIV, everyone had a full heal move that can be recharged every 20 seconds. And let me tell you, as a Final Fantasy XIV fan, the healers don't need less shit to do. Okay, that was just a little Final Fantasy XIV humor from me, but seriously, healing in this game is super broken on a fundamental level. And I don't just mean like all of the healing moves, no, I mean just the literal heal move you can unlock is better than anything else in the entire game, bar none. Though that's ironic because to get the better healing moves, you need to put a lot of points into it, and really all that's different is just cost a little more and you get a little more healing. That's really it. But let's actually begin explaining the combat and, well, the leveling system too, because it's tied into it. See, every level you gain around 4 skill points that can be used to unlock abilities or stat bonus, kind of like the spear grid or the job board from Final Fantasy XII. Some characters can be more proficient at doing certain things, but overall, you're better off just focusing on one weapon and maybe magic. I'll explain in a moment why. And after unlocking them, you can place them in a 6x3 row that allows you to select the move that you have on you already. But here's the problem. The first basic move is already probably the best, or maybe the next free move, because it deals a good chunk of damage already. All weapons are like this as well, so there comes very little reason why you should even bother with any other weapon than the one you were already given, unless you want some visual difference, but even then, not really. Because again, at the end of the day, all the weapons deal around the same amount of damage. That's really it. And really, these moves are not here for this system of the 6x3, well, in some regard, because more times than not, they are used more for the other mechanic in the game, combos. Combos are basically just stringing a few attacks together to deal a lot of damage. However, in order to prevent spamming these attacks, you need to use AC points or action points. Magic ironically doesn't require AC and can't be used in combo, except as finishers, which I get in some regard due to the nature of magic, because it takes a while before a spell can be used because you have to wait for the timer to start, then wait for the cast timer to actually go too. And even then, it's really not worth it. Unless you're going against elementals, which will deal the most damage to them, which, there's really not enough of them to be worth noting or trying to gain a lot of spells into it, but I did so anyway, which I think was to my detriment because I could have just put them into their stats, but again, In any case, these can range from 2 attacks to 6 attacks, though it really depends on how many you have depending on with the weapons and their skills, but really, more times than not, you're never just going to use them on fodder enemies unless you really want to and just get a fight out of the way. Because more times than not, they're only matter for boss battles since they can deal a lot of damage, and more times than not, a single attack from all members on one enemy is more than enough. Except bosses, which ironically have way too much health. Like, all the common fodder enemies have basic amount of health, but bosses and big enemies have way too much health. Like, overall way too much. And why I say combos are meant for them, but even then, all you're doing is just putting more time into just basically defeating them. That's really all it is, because it is just a waiting game until you beat them. And really, the only thing combos are really useful for are jugglings, and that's the only way you can do it to enemies. And even then, not really, because again, you could just mostly kill them in a few attacks. And even then, for 2 characters, Leonard and Caesar, you really don't want to use them for that because they need the AC points in order to use their knight forms. Yeah, the knight form, after unlocking it, requires around 7 AC points to transform. However, you could actually chip in more points, up to 15, to make the form way more powerful to use more powerful moves. Problem is, you won't ever use these moves unless you want to, because more times than not, just the basic attack will do more than enough. And sometimes some people would wonder, well, what about the damage? Well, again, usually more times than not, you'll be having other team members who will just heal you for free, for a lack of a better term, so you're fine. And only time I ever had to worry about it was when I was alone. And even then, not really. But going back to boss enemies and big enemies, really they are simple to fight because there's only like 2 of them, 4-legged and 2-legged, which both of them share the same strategy of hit their legs until they go down on their knees and then swipe at their head for big damage. That's really it. There's nothing more than that. And honestly, the only boss I remember was this one, and that's just because we called him Jackass the Giant. God, that was still hilarious. And that's just really how brain dead this game really is. There is nothing about this gameplay that is really all that engaging. It's just brain dead, but not even in a fun way like Dynasty Warriors, where in that game, it's all about wrecking shit and hitting enemies a lot. Yeah, it's simple, but it sells itself on that simplicity, you know what I mean? While in this game, its overall simplicity hurts it overall way more than anything else. But you might be saying to yourself, this game can't be that simple, surely you're leaving out some mechanic. And sadly, I'm really not. In fact, I have described mostly all the mechanics in the game. I haven't mentioned side quests, well, that's because we need to mention this other thing that, well, if you've ever played the game or have seen someone else review the game, you probably would have noticed the lack of me talking about this person. See, I lied in the beginning when I talked about how the game begun, because the game actually begins with character creation. You wanna know what he's for? Online mode. But yet, he is a part of the plot, for like an hour before the game literally tosses him to the side. And when I say this, I say this with no hyperbole. They are never mentioned or even referenced once after this. I would love to ask the writer why they even bothered creating this character in the plot if they planned on doing nothing with them. It's like if in Lord of the Rings, there was this one guy that the crew met on their journey, and he had his own quest and doing his own thing, but no one ever mentioned him. Oh wait, oh my god, I covered that game already. Oh my god, how did I forget? My point is, if they serve no purpose beyond multiplayer, which is dead and was going to die either or, what's the point of them? And at this point, you're mostly making a solo RPG, so why? And before somebody says, well, you can still do some of the side quests, I would say, yeah, but there comes a point where it's literally impossible. Like, it is just fundamentally impossible. Like, the first quest you are given requires you to be so many levels ahead of the enemies in that sector to even stand a chance that it's just unlikely for you to even win. It's not helped that this game's end level is like 35, if even that, because I did grind for gear, though ironically did not fight a lot in the final dungeon, which is very ironic for me. I'm going to side note for a moment and say, I do think it's cool that every time an armor is on them and it's equipped, you actually see it on the character. Sadly, there's not a lot of variety to them, and everyone just wears the same sort of armor, so it just becomes this dull thing. I'm more confused if anything, but whatever. But in any case, even if I did these side quests, what would I gain then material for stuff that I wouldn't even do? Like, there's this whole sequence where you unlock binding, and let me just tell you straight up, I didn't even bother. Not once, because it never seemed worth it. Because you have to put so much time and effort into it, that it only seems like something for endgame stuff, rather than the main game, if you catch my drift. In fact, you wanna know how long this game is? Like, if we took out all the needless piddling I did on my own time, this game would be around 20 hours. If I could have shrunken the time because of the timer, I would easily argue I could have done this game in around 10 hours, if even that. Because, if I'm being honest, without all that piddling, what even is this game about? Because let me be clear about this, because we need to talk about it now because we're going to the story. This game is basically just a massive part 1. You might have noticed earlier I didn't talk about the plot all that much. In broad strokes, sure, but that's really it. You see, remember that quote in the beginning? See, that was a lot. This game's plot is barely, and I say this with so much anger in my heart, barely set up for anything. And it only begins setting up things till the end, and it does really nothing with it. As the game basically ends with us failing to stop the main villain from getting what they want, and an important character dying. Spoilers, by the way, but who cares? Kara was barely a character to begin with. There's no way in hell you can convince me to care enough about her. I swear on my life, this plot is both short and yet wasteful with every second it has. The only character I actually grew to like was Caesar, because it felt like they were actually starting to do stuff and like, finally, something is going on, but it's like, did you really need to waste all that time beforehand doing absolutely nothing? In fact, I kind of want to talk about Caesar a little more because there's this scene that just gets on my nerves. Okay, remember what I said about the characters not talking to each other all that much? Well, there's a scene where Caesar's in it, and it really emblematically shows all of it. When the team is after this guy called Seti, we'll learn about him more later, to try to learn more about the Knight lore, well, he is then saved by the Black Knight. But he was like, oh hey, a new ally. And everyone else was telling him, no, that's their enemy. Like, what? Why the hell did none of you tell him who you guys are fighting? Why was it now that you decide to tell him? Like, what? Did you think he would just get it all on a glance? No! And therein lies my bigger problem. Just explaining what's going on feels worthless because it feels like the plot's gonna forget it as well. And it just felt like every time we kept going, something more annoying and just something that just keeps getting me annoyed and annoyed.
Like the Troy Baker plot line, which is just a plot line that does nothing in this plot. It is a middle finger to anyone who cares because it will not be resolved in this game. It will be resolved in the next game. But fuck you. No one should be waiting that long for this much setup. Come the fuck on. And honestly, I wouldn't have cared so much if this wasn't just a huge part 1 and this was just setting up for the next game, which, again, why are you setting up so much stuff for the next game instead of doing something right now? And you want to know another thing? I was planning on honestly critiquing and talking about the plot as we went along, but it felt like at the end of the day, all my rage would just basically make it all spiral out of control where I would just start talking about this next thing that pissed me off. Cause I had to ask, why are we even here? This plot does fuck all. It wastes its time doing absolutely nothing for the vast majority of its time. And when it actually wants to do something, it's like, oops, we're done now. Go buy the next game to find out what happens next. You might be noticing that my anger is like I'm so done. Because I just want to say my final thoughts on this right now. This game is bad. It's a type of bad I did not think I would find. I thought I would enjoy myself. It would be a simple game to enjoy. But no, every fucking time I try to think about this game, nothing but boredom or anger comes out of me. It's why the beginning part was so bored. It's why I sound so lackadaisical, because the more I went into this, the more my anger just kind of spiraled out. And I didn't want that. I wanted to be fair, but nothing about this game is all that good. And I'm wondering, why do you all think this game is good? Or at least decent? There's nothing redeemable about this game. Except maybe the soundtrack and the aesthetics. But really, if that's all you're defending, then we could just be doing something else. Because let's be clear about this. The story is just a big part 1, if even that, with the characters being some of the most boring, generic things ever. Like, holy shit, they are so boring. With gameplay, that just makes me wonder, why? I don't know why they thought this was good. I don't know who thought this was a good thing. It is some of the most boring gameplay I have ever felt. I almost felt like I was playing Final Fantasy 13, but Final Fantasy 13 is way longer and more stupid, so it gets my vitriol way more. God damn. God damn it.